So welcome. This is actually session number 28 of Neighboring 101. This is the online class where we talk with leaders in the neighboring movement nationwide, and we discover ways that organizations and individuals can use this art and skill of neighboring as part of community and personal development. I think many of you have found that this class is kind of like a first step that you can take to get engaged with this topic. And we all have that goal of making our neighborhoods clean, safe, and friendly. Those are important aspects, and nothing benefits a community or a neighborhood more than connecting with your neighbors, growing your social capital, and increasing that sense of belonging in a community. So thank you for being here and being part of the class. Just a reminder, if you're new to the class, these class videos are available on YouTube. They are unlisted, and the way you get the link to the videos is paying attention to those emails you get from me, either a reminder about the upcoming class or a recap of the class that we've just had. You'll find at the bottom of that email links to all of our past classes and the videos of those classes. So some interesting topics and speakers. And if you're fairly new, I'd encourage you to go back and watch some of those past videos. So this is the month of February, and our learning goal for this month is understanding how getting to know your neighbors can enrich your life. And as our guest notes in his book, right at the very end of his book, if we all cared about our neighbors, we could change the world one street at a time. So I thumbed back through this book last night. It's a great read, and I think some great insight, and really excited to talk with the author today. Let me go ahead and introduce our guest, Peter Lovenheim. He is an author and journalist whose articles and essays have appeared in New York Times, New York Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, Parade, Politico, the Washington Post. The list goes on and on. And in 2008, he wrote an essay that was published in the New York Times under the title, "Won't You Be My Neighbor?" And it ended up being a very popular essay online and generated a lot of feedback to him. And eventually it led to his book. I don't know if this will appear since my background is blurry, probably not. But eventually it led to his book, In the Neighborhood. There we go, In the Neighborhood. It may have a different cover now, the newer version. Megan, I think, was holding hers up as well. In the Neighborhood, the search for community on an American street, one sleepover at a time. And Peter lived on the same street for much of his life, but after a murder happened on his block, he was struck by how few neighbors he knew. So he decided to get to know them. Peter, welcome. Thank you for being our guest, and thank you for writing this great book.
Well, thanks very much, and it's a delight to be here.
It's a delight to meet you and have you. So tell us, how did your neighboring journey begin?
Well, it began like you described. There was a tragedy on my suburban street up in Rochester, New York. There was a family down the street, a husband and wife. They were both physicians, and they had two middle school age children, a boy and a girl. One night, the husband came home and shot and killed his wife, and then killed himself. The kids ran screaming into the night. And soon after that, the kids moved to another part of town to live with their grandparents. So in effect, this family who had lived on my street for 7 years effectively had vanished overnight. And besides absorbing the tragedy of it, I was struck by how little this calamity actually affected the neighborhood. I had known this couple just a little bit, to say hi or bye if I saw them driving down the street. And in asking around, I found that nobody else in the neighborhood knew this family well, but also I learned that nobody actually knew each other very well, besides a kind of casual relationship. So I asked myself the question, like, do I live in an actual neighborhood, or just on a street surrounded by people whose lives are entirely separate from my own. And that was the genesis of the book, because I got curious about how we live as neighbors in America today, and what we lose by living so often as strangers to each other. And I wanted to see if I could get to know my neighbors beyond a superficial level, and really know them in an intimate way, and how would that affect me? How would it affect the life in our neighborhood? That's how the book got started.
I love the whole premise. And you had some neighbors that didn't agree to have a sleepover,
Yeah,
but those who did, spending that amount of time with them was really insightful into their habits and their
yeah,
backgrounds. I just love the detail that you would pick up on those neighbors, sort of a crash course on learning about your neighbor.
right. Well, the idea of sleeping over didn't come to me all at once. It took me about 6 months to sort of wrestle with that question. Well, how would you get to know your neighbors in an intimate way? Because I felt like just taking them out to a coffee shop and doing an interview wouldn't really get me where I wanted to be. So I scratched my head over that question for about 6 months. And at some point, I remembered my experience as a kid sleeping over at my friends' houses. And it wasn't actually the sleeping over that I liked so much, as I recalled. It was the waking up the next morning, because we'd all come down to breakfast together. And this was a time when people still ate meals together in a family, I guess. But I'd sit around the table with my friend and his family, and there were people there who I didn't really know well, like my friend's dad or my friend's older sister, for example. But I'd sit and listen to the conversation over breakfast, and through that, I got a sense of what life in this house was like and what the relationships were among the people in the family. And then the next time I went over to play at my friend's house, it didn't feel like a strange place. I really had a sense of what life was like inside that home. So I thought, well, gee, maybe my neighbors would let me sleep over at their houses and write about their lives on our street from inside their own homes. And as you say, not everybody agreed. But ultimately, I think it was about 50% of the people who I approached said yes. And that was not just like knocking on the door and saying, can I sleep over? We started with, meeting at a neutral place, meeting at Starbucks, and just talking about the whole concept of neighboring and the tragedy that had occurred on our street. But eventually people felt comfortable with me and I with them. And when I suggested, gee, maybe I could write about a 24-hour chronicle of your life, and they that sounds great. And I'd say, well, maybe I could just bunk overnight and we could start as soon as you get up in the morning. And everybody was fine with that. And I'll also say, David, the few people who didn't want me to sleep over, I respect their decisions, because it wasn't that they weren't interested in becoming better neighbors. It was just that they had a higher threshold for privacy, because I was very open with people that I'm writing a book, I'm using my real name, I'm going to use your real name. So some people were, more comfortable with that than others.
Right. And you were quoting them and really telling it the way it was. And we get to learn about Lou and his nightcap and other things. So some people might not have been comfortable with that, but that wasn't the only thing you did to meet neighbors. I was really intrigued. Not only did you get to know your postman real well, you took on a daring trip with the newspaper delivery guy. That was a near-death experience, it sounded like, through the neighborhood.
Almost lost my breakfast with that.
And then you tell this story about a woman that you saw walking through the neighborhood almost every day, and you realized you didn't know who she was or know her name.
Right. So
can you talk to us a little bit about that situation?
Yeah, that was a woman named Grace. And I have to back up and say that at this point, I was actually living in the house that I was raised in. After my parents retired, my family and I took over the house. And I haven't lived there for 25 years at that point, but I remembered it from being a kid. And I was struck when I saw Grace walking in our neighborhood, because I remembered as a kid seeing that same woman walking in our neighborhood. I had never spoken to her as a child. I don't recall that my parents or any other adults did. And because now I was writing this book, I took the initiative, and one day I approached Grace as she walked in front of my house, and asked her if I could talk to her as part of this book. And what I learned was amazing to me. Without any exaggeration, Grace had walked in my neighborhood simply for exercise nearly every day for 40 years. I mean, back to the Kennedy administration. She didn't live in the neighborhood, she lived nearby, but she liked the neighborhood because it was quite beautiful, and there were sidewalks and tree cover over the sidewalks. So she'd come to the neighborhood, park her car, and she would walk for, I don't know, an hour or something for exercise. By the time I met her, she was 82, as I recall. She let me come over to her apartment and do a more formal interview with her. And among the things I learned was that, well, she had never married. She didn't have children. She lived alone. But as a young woman, she had studied piano and voice, as I recall, at the Juilliard School in New York, and was an accomplished pianist. And I thought, what a loss. If we had known that when I was, well, at any point, I mean, I had young children when I was writing this book. If I'd known that, maybe Grace, when she was younger, could have taught my kids, piano. She certainly would have been an interesting person to speak to on a daily basis. She was a great example of the richness that surrounds us that we often don't know about until we really get to know people. So that was Grace's story.
Yeah, we talk quite a bit in this class about discovering the gifts of your neighborhood.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. Gifts. Yeah.
That in some cases that may be sort of the assets of the neighborhood itself. Maybe you have a park that adjoins it, but it's also about those hidden gifts and talents of your neighbors. We have to go beyond just knowing their name, and I've been amazed myself at the hidden talents and gifts that my neighbors had that I had no idea about, and that came through very loud and clear in your book, because you had several great musicians. You had some really accomplished, intelligent people, very capable of things, and some really unique skills that it would have been, it was really easy to just never know anything about those and never put them to use.
I mean, I'll just to build on what you're saying, as a journalist, I've also learned over the years from interviewing lots of people that, without any exceptions that I can think of, everybody's life looked at closely enough. It's really quite amazing, because everybody has challenges and struggles that they have to learn how to overcome. They have situations they have to learn how to live with. Their stories are remarkable once you know them at an intimate level. And I think in that sense, even beyond people who have something tangible to offer us, whether they're a musician or a physician or something, like all our neighbors are really exceptional when seen up closely enough, and they're all sort of gifts in that sense.
Yeah. So why do you think we don't make an effort to get to know our neighbors? Maybe not the people in this group, but I'm talking in general. Are we Americans? Are we just too busy? Are we too selfish? Or maybe it's something else. Why do you think we don't make that effort?
I don't know that we're selfish. I think maybe couple things come to mind. One is there is a certain skill set in learning how to approach a person you don't know and opening a casual conversation. I don't know that we maybe have lost some of those skills over the generations. I kind of notice with younger people today, like if we're in an elevator, nobody will talk. Whereas when I was younger, I remember like the adults all were kind of like chit-chatting about the weather and whatever else in the elevator. I don't know. There's something about those relational skills that I think maybe because of social media and the time we spend on the computer and watching screens of all different types, maybe we've just kind of lost that skill. Another factor I would point to is, I mean, there's been 2 or maybe 3 generations now of children raised with learning about stranger danger. And I remember when I was teaching writing at the college level, my students who were then like 20 years old or so, they were just raised to assume that anybody they didn't know was a danger to them. Whereas I think in previous generations, the assumption was, oh, that person I don't know, they might be interesting, they might be valuable, they might need a friend. But now this whole stranger danger thing has left generations afraid of strangers. And I suppose it's probably a topic for a different day, but like I never bought into that. I think the whole thing was blown up out of all proportion. And there was never any reason to teach children that all strangers are dangerous. A lot of it was hyped by the media, by false claims, just as an example, and then I'll get off this rant. But I looked into it once, and at least at the time I checked this out, there was never any verified case of children being poisoned by Halloween candy, for example, with the exception of a couple cases that involved the child's own parent or other relative. But there was never any confirmed case of a child being deliberately poisoned by a stranger in collecting Halloween candy. And yet that little mythology was blown up as one of the reasons to teach children about the dangers posed by strangers. All right, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective and set of circumstances, not one that I think I've heard other people reference. So that's interesting. Thank you for that. And when you mentioned the elevator too, I have to laugh and think of the current commercials from Progressive Insurance where they're teaching people not to be like their dad, and the guy gets on the elevator and he tries to strike up a conversation, and this mentor is with him saying, oh, no, we don't do that, that's not how we act on that elevator. And my kids love those commercials because every time they come out with a new set of them, they're like, Dad, that's you, because I still step on an elevator and try to talk with people, and this now makes me the focus of a hilarious TV commercial about something you should never do. And the other one they just released is a guy cleaning his trash bins, and I've been caught doing that too. So my kids think I'm the source of content for these commercials.
Yeah.
So that's
also, I mean, with the political correctness today, like you never know, any slight misuse of a term can, be a microaggression and offend people. So people are afraid to make casual conversation.
Yeah.
But one of the effects of that is the loss of friendly relationships that can be formed through casual conversation.
Yeah. Let me ask another question, and then I'm going to see if Megan has some questions she wants to ask, because I know she dog-eared her book some and things, but I think you kind of make reference to this in your book a little bit about maybe this lack of neighboring connection relationship might be more of a measure of affluence, where maybe more affluent neighborhoods or there's less connection. Do you think that's an accurate statement, or you want to expand upon that thought
Well,
some?
I was concerned about that issue even before I started writing the book, because my neighborhood at that time was rather affluent, with a lot of professionals on the street, relatively large homes with relatively large yards. And I asked myself, is what I'm experiencing in this neighborhood because of that affluence? Because if it was, I didn't really want to write the book, because it wouldn't really apply, to everybody. But I checked out the sociological literature on that. And what I found is that is not the case, according to the studies that have been done. The same, a comparable degree of, let's say, anonymity exists in all neighborhoods, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of the size of the houses or the size of the lots. There are exceptions, by the way. I mean, in almost every city or town, you can find, some pocket of a neighborhood where people do know each other and they have a very rich, social capital within that neighborhood. But in general, the studies showed that this degree of separation, if you will, is common across the board.
And I think I have, at least qualitatively, seen that those neighborhoods where you do have that increased connectedness, it's oftentimes the result of one person or one family who's really taken those energetic steps to build those connections. Kind of like what you did yourself in your own neighborhood.
Yeah.
But they're the ones that'll host a get together or do something. They're kind of the spark plug that has made it happen.
And one of the things I learned from speaking across the country about the book is that that's not a static situation. You can have what's sometimes called a convener, that one person who brings the neighborhood together, but that person may end up moving, may get busy with other things, and a neighborhood that was once very connected can devolve to a neighborhood where people don't know each other again. So it's sort of a constant challenge to keep up those connections. Let me add just one other thing. Another thing I learned from speaking across the country about this book is that by and large, like, everybody really does want to have closer connections with their neighbors. Maybe not everybody, but I would say I would put it at 90% at least. It's just that most people, as I say, don't know quite how to do it. They themselves don't have the time or the skill set to be the convener. But most people, I think, want the same things. They want a sense of being known by the people they're physically closest to, and to know others.
To be known and know others. Yes.
Yeah.
That's great. Megan, did you have a question or two you wanted to ask today? Or?
Yes, thank you so much. It's so exciting to get to talk to you, and thank you to David for bringing us all together. One of the things that was really interesting to me in thinking about how so many times now we're outsourcing care, as we have gone through the generations, it feels like we're outsourcing our parental care. Kids are in more like corporate daycare kind of situations. We're outsourcing our elderly care. We're we outsource our lawn care, we outsource, all of these various things. And one of the aspects of your book that was so interesting to me was some of those transactional relationships that you explored in terms of, hey, in this neighborhood, we have lawn care companies, so we're not chatting over the fence, or in terms of folks that knew some of your neighbors in your neighborhood best were those people that were in transactional relationships with you all. So the gentleman who delivers the paper, the mail carrier. Could you talk a little bit about, just reflect on your experience with that, about kind of community care? And then, there's also some wonderful storylines where, thanks to your facilitation, neighbors did end up caring for one another, and kind of the gift that was. Could you explore that a little bit?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. To the examples you gave of outsourcing care, I would also add pet care. Dog walkers, doggy daycare, because pets used to be one of the primary ways that people met their neighbors when they were both out walking their dogs. Although, as I point out in the book, sometimes the dogs would get to know each other, but the neighbors wouldn't. They'd introduce their dogs, but not themselves. But still, taking dogs out for a walk, or strolling, taking children, young children out for a walk in the stroller is a very classic way of neighbors meeting each other. And when you outsource that, it eliminates that opportunity. I live now part of the year in Washington, D.C., in a very urban environment, and people in DC here are often so focused on their jobs and their careers. There's an awful lot of nannies you see at any playground. And, that's nice, but it also, means the parents are not meeting each other. I'm sorry, but what was the second half of your question?
I was just one of the observations about the book that I found so interesting was that some of the most intimate relationships that you had between neighbors in your neighborhood were the ones that really were explicitly transactional. The paper, the paper here, the mail here.
Yeah, the one that I think I was most moved by was that our mail carrier knew an awful lot about many of the neighbors, more so than other neighbors. And I think I tell the story in there that he noticed one elderly resident who was not taking their mail where they used to, and it was he who determined that this person had become ill and needed help, and somehow managed to reach one of the residents' adult children. I forget the details of that story. It's in the book, but he also was the one who told me about what he called misdirected mail, that you can judge or you can evaluate the friendliness of a neighborhood by what people do when they get mail delivered to them that is really intended for a neighbor. Do they return it to the mail carrier for redelivery, or do they walk it over to the neighbor? And over the course of his career, he had worked, I think, in 4 different neighborhoods. And he said that was a pretty reliable way of measuring the degree of friendliness in the neighborhood.
Yeah, one of the other great relationships, and I think that Megan's referencing, is how Lou ended up helping take care of Patty as well.
Oh, yeah.
I know you'd helped with that some too, but.
Yeah, well, that, when I started the book, I saw it primarily as really what I thought of as a sociological study, looking at how we live as neighbors today and wondering if I could get to know my neighbors at an intimate level. But once I met one of my neighbors, Patty DeNitto, who lived only 3 doors down from me. She'd been there 3 years. I'd never met her, didn't even know her name until someone suggested I contact her. But Patty at that point was a single mom with 2 young children, 2 young girls. She'd recently divorced. And on top of that, she was a radiologist, and she'd recently diagnosed her own breast cancer. And once I got to know Patty, I realized that if there was anybody on our street who needed the support of a friendly neighborhood, it was her. because as her illness progressed, she lost the ability to drive, but she still needed to get to doctor's appointments. And sometimes she'd be delayed, which meant that when her young girls got home from school, there was nobody home. So at that point, the goal of this whole project for me shifted. And instead of seeing the book as just a sociological experiment, I wanted to see if it would be possible to kind of patch together a real supportive neighborhood behind Patty, and at least give her some extra help as she went through this illness. And because I'd met Lou, the older retired physician, who was always looking for something to do and someone to help out, but didn't know how quite to do it, connecting Lou with Patty was one of the goals. And having some other neighbors who maybe could meet Patty's girls when they got off the school bus, walk them home, stay with them till Patty got home from an appointment, So that was the second, that's a story in the second half of the book.
Yeah, that's lovely. Megan, you have another question? Or
Yes, I'm so sorry. Just to follow up on that. Thank you, David. One of the things that I thought was really touching is, David, you posed the question earlier, why do you think we, aren't better neighbors, or are we inherently selfish? And with this story, Peter, that you're telling about Lou and Patty, the thing that occurred to me is that I wonder if neighbors don't want to inconvenience anyone. Like, oh, I don't want to inconvenience them. I don't want to ask. I don't want to impose upon someone else. And really, could you speak to kind of how the care of Patty really, what that meant for Lou, and kind of what Lou's experience was in that relationship? Because that really struck me, like, who was the giver and who was the receiver there?
Right. Yeah, that's a very nice point. I mean, Lou, as I said, Lou was a wonderful man. He became like a father figure to me, certainly a mentor. And he was lonely. His wife had died. His 6 adult children all lived elsewhere. He had a dog he walked. He tried to get to the Y a couple times a week to meet his buddies, but other than that, he didn't have much going on in his life. And he was used to helping people as a physician all his life. He'd been a surgeon, and here in his later years, he had not very much to do. So for him to be able to be of help to Patty, who then was, I think, I'm going to say in her 30s, down the street, was really a gift. But that never would have happened without, the chance of my having met them both through writing this book and learning about what they needed and what they each could give. And there were a couple other neighbors as well who came into this supportive circle. But you're right. There's this whole question of, well, I don't want to be interfering, One of the questions that I used to talk with the neighbors about, I forget who first raised it, was, okay, so they'd say, we want to be a good neighbor, but sometimes it's hard to know what to do. Like, what do we do if we see an ambulance parked down the street at a neighbor's house? I mean, are we supposed to call them the next day and ask, are you okay? Or that could be very embarrassing or intrusive. We don't, what's the right answer to that? And what if you substitute the ambulance for a police car? I'm not sure there's clear-cut answers to those questions. I would, based on my experience now after writing this book, I would pretty much always err on the side of at least picking up the phone and asking if there's any way you can be of help, because you never know. Yeah, the intrusiveness thing is a good point. I think by and large, though, people welcome others reaching out. And if it's intrusive, they'll say so. But if it isn't, it could help save a life.
Yeah.
Or
Well,
a marriage.
Yeah, certainly in my past years, I always erred on the side of just not saying anything, not asking. I didn't want to be intrusive. But since I've had a paradigm shift about what it means to be an engaged neighbor,
Mhm.
I've had several instances here just in the past year, even 3 that come to mind immediately, to check and to see if everybody was okay and what was going on. And every one of those situations, the neighbor, even one of these that was way down the street, have just been so thankful that someone checked in on
Mhm.
them.
Mhm.
I was really kind of surprised, I guess, that they seem to appreciate someone's interest that much. So I do think that's important.
Yeah.
Something that I had really intentionally avoided in the past.
You know, another thing I've learned from speaking about the book around the country is that it often, oddly and sadly, takes a disaster to bring neighbors together. And I heard these stories over and over again. So in California, it was earthquakes and fires. In the South, it was, floods and hurricanes. In the Northeast, it was bad snowstorms. But people would tell the story of a natural disaster striking their community, their neighborhood, power goes out, people have to come out of their homes, they need help with heating, they need help with getting food. And almost to a person, they report this as a very positive experience. I had one guy I remember in Florida who told me during what was Hurricane Andrew, his neighborhood lost power. They all had to cook on portable gas stoves in the middle of the street for several days. And he said, we got to know each other and people recognized me who I didn't even think knew I lived on the street, and et cetera. And he said, and then the power came back on, everybody went inside, the air conditioning worked again. And he said, I actually find myself hoping for the next hurricane so we can all catch up. But it's sort of funny and it's sort of sad that it takes sometimes that type of calamity for people to come out and get to know each other. But it does establish the fact, I believe, that ultimately we really all like that. We like living in community. We don't like living anonymously, for the most part.
Great example. Great example. Others that are online today have a question or two they would like to ask from their own experience or own neighborhood or background. This is your chance. I've always got questions, but I want somebody else to.
How do you
Okay.
start? What would be a good, brave first step with neighbors that you don't?
I think are we talking about a residential street?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I heard this one story. Somebody on a radio show called in and he told me that he had new people had moved in across the street and he meant to get over to welcome them. But somehow 2 years had gone by and he hadn't managed to get there yet. So finally, feeling unbearable guilt, he bought what he described as a bucket of snails. And he took them over to the house and he gave them as a gift and by way of apologizing for being so slow in getting over. I mean, that's one way, I suppose. But short of buying snails, I think just if your neighborhood has a listserv and you know each other's emails, you can just send an email and, hey, be nice to get to know each other just in case we ever need to be of help to each other. Would you be interested in getting coffee sometime? something like that. Some people also, there are other things you can do on a more regular basis. For example, some people plant like a little garden in their front yard, even out near the street if it's allowed, rather than the backyard or the side yard, so that you're out there more often. And when people do walk by or when they do come out of their homes, you're in a better position to say a casual hello and make that connection informally.
Yeah. April, did I see your hand up? I think I saw you raise your hand like you had a question you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I was gonna just say something about my neighborhood. When he was talking about whether it's different in affluent neighborhoods or less affluent neighborhoods, and I was thinking when I moved into my neighborhood, it was one of the same things. I went out front. It was October when I purchased my house, and so I went out front and started planting tulip and daffodil bulbs, and all the kids in the neighborhood came and said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" So I just told them, I said, "Come help," and they came down and started helping me plant flowers, and that's how I got to know them and know their parents. And we went to movies together, and I had a barbecue, and we gave them hot dogs. We had to clean up on the block. I mean, we just started doing stuff in the neighborhood. And so we really just became a big family, on our block. And so it was just—
That's great. Those
there.
flowers you planted really bloomed.
Yes.
Very nice.
April would be a great neighbor to have, I'm telling you.
Yeah, I love my neighbors. I love people. And so, wherever I go, I just get to know people and everything, and it just blossoms.
Yeah. I see someone mentions here, if you're in a neighborhood that has a neighborhood association or have regular meetings, that might be a place to start as well. Some of those association meetings could be both good and bad experiences, I guess. But
yeah, let me offer another suggestion for those who live in apartment buildings, because when I'm in Washington, I'm living in a large apartment building, which is a very different experience than in a residential community. I mean, residential street. But it became really frustrating because I didn't know anybody in this building of like 250 people, even after several years. But then somebody started an informal social hour that has really worked very nicely. And it's not organized by the building management. It's just, we talked about the convener person who takes the initiative. He just started inviting people on a, occasional Monday evening, come down to the lobby, bring a drink if you'd like, bring some snacks to share, and we'll just sit around and chat. And it started out with like 6 people. And we do it every maybe 5 or 6 weeks, but the last time there were about 25 people. And there's lots to eat, and you can come and go as you want. And now I know a few people in this building that I didn't before.
yeah, it's a great example.
Yeah.
I have this theory that a lot of Americans think they're already a good neighbor because they smile and wave at their neighbors. They don't know them by name, of course, but they smile and wave, and that's their threshold of measuring a good neighbor.
I think some people define that being a good neighbor as keeping their yard looking nice. Putting their trash out and taking the garbage barrel, the trash can back after pickup, just those sort of cosmetic things.
Yes. Yeah. So we need to learn to step out of our comfort zone and learn to be a convener, to try and build those connections and try and change that narrative a little bit about what that really means to be not just a good neighbor, but an engaged neighbor. Be the change that we want to see. Anyone else in the class with a question?
I've got a comment. I would just like to say thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome. Great to be
I
here.
really enjoyed you today.
Thank you.
And if you haven't gotten the book or had a chance to read from the library, I'll put another plug in for it in the neighborhood. It's a good read. It's worth your time.
Yeah. You know, could I, oh, go ahead, sorry.
There's an echo. Joe, were you getting ready to ask a
Yes.
question?
I was, you know, again, when I first when we built our second house, we're like the homesteaders. There's nobody around on either side. But as the development occurred, you know, and I touched 7 property lines because I'm in a cul-de-sac. So everybody wanted me to split their fence with them. And I said, we do the chain link fence. So the 3 neighbors that did the privacy fence, I go, no, you know, if you're not going to put in the chain link fence, then I'm not going to help you pay for your privacy fence because they're 6 feet tall. And so those 3, and the one directly behind me, I've had 7 different neighbors, 7 different people in 30 years occupy that house. And I got to know their cats. But that's about all I got to know, because you could, you know, it's 6 feet tall and we're like that TV show where we're talking over the fence, but they're not really acquaintances on the others, because I do still kind of mow my yard. You kind of talk to the other 4 lots, and you know, privacy fences. And I've got several friends that own fencing companies, and you know, that's the big deal. And I go like, it's to keep neighbors out. He goes, no, it's to keep dogs in, Joe. You know that. And I go like, so I don't mind a 4-foot fence, 36-inch fence, but I find those and there are a lot of them strung out in the neighborhood. Not everybody has a privacy fence. Mostly have chain link fence, but somehow I find that more appealing, where you can talk over the back fence. And then what I decided to do was get these all, because now I'm in my 2nd generation in the neighborhood. So got a lot of men and women that are under the age of, you know, 40 and under, you know, got kids, the neighborhood's revitalizing. So I've been targeting guys that have like 2 or 3 small children, said, hey, let's go have a beer. So normally they ask on Mondays, like, hey, where are we going for beer? Because, you know, I'm full of advice and life experiences, and because whatever they're going through, more than likely I've gone through. So I think we enjoy our, I guess, friendship more than with the women, because I always have to call up and say, you know, can you check with your wife, see if you can come out with Joe, you know, next Monday, and here's where we're going, you know, and they go, I don't have to check, you know, but they do. So,
Well, that's
but
a good
again,
point you make about the fences. Yeah.
So again, it just, I think part of, because I recognize, like you, that the first generation went away that was there, and I didn't know any of the people that moved in. And so I go like, I got to make an effort to reach my hand out to all these new neighbors with kids. So
Yeah. Thank you, Joe, for sharing that. Joe is like a good neighbor. He's a State Farm agent, so he's speaking from the heart on that topic, and advice on fences and other things as well. So thanks for sharing that. Well, Peter, before we wrap up, and thank you again for your time today, I just wanted to give you another chance to just wrap up with, if you have a favorite story from your neighboring experience, or a favorite story that you heard when you were speaking around the country, anything else that you'd like to share to wrap us up today.
You know, I think I'd like to end on a little serious note, getting back to the original tragedy that started my journey in the neighborhood, because what I learned from talking to people about this couple, the murder-suicide, where the husband killed his wife and then himself, I learned that on the day that she was killed, my neighbor feared her husband. Their marriage had not been healthy for a while, and she was quite concerned about her safety and the safety of her young kids. She called her best friend, who lived in the city, 3 times that day, and left messages that are increasingly anxious. I know, because I listened to those messages subsequently. And I think she might have been wanting to see if she could take her kids and sleep over at her friend's house that night before her husband got home. But her friend was out of town on a business trip, so she wasn't able to reach her. So she did what she could. She picked her kids up after school. She took them to the library to do their homework, got them some dinner. But then at 9:30 at night, she brought them home and told them to go upstairs and get ready for bed. That's when her husband got home. He disabled her car. He had canceled her cell phone service earlier in the day. So my theory is that if my neighbor wanted to get out of the house at that late hour with her kids, her options were limited to going to any of the other 35 houses on our street. But she didn't do that. And I think the reason is she didn't know anybody well enough to do it. Because it takes a lot, to go to a stranger's house and admit your marriage is so far off track that you're afraid to be at home. You have to at least know somebody, I think, to take that risk. So I just mentioned that as a closing point, that this business of being good neighbors is, it's nice, it enriches our lives, but it also can be very important in a particular situation where, where people are not safe. And it's worth keeping in mind.
Yes, that's excellent. Yeah, that is a tragic example, and you relate in the book how that moved you. And thank you for that reminder, because any one of us might need that safety net, or we might be able to be the person that provides that safety net to a neighbor, and both are equally important. Very powerful. Thank you very much for sharing that. Well, we want to be good stewards of your time and those that are online, so we try to wrap up right at 1 o'clock, and we're right about at that hour. So just want to encourage you that have listened in to today and to ask that question we try to always ask at the end of every month: how are you going to use the information that you have heard today? Maybe you're compelled to go read the whole book. I would encourage you to do that. It's a good one. But how is this information going to change what you do? How is it going to impact your neighborhood and your life? Be asking yourself that question: how can I put some of these principles and ideas into practice? And as the author says toward the end of his book, change our world one street at a time. So Peter Lovenheim, thank you for being here, for joining us, and to everyone who joined in today, thank you. Great to see everybody.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye.